Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the newest exhibit here at the National Atomic Testing Museum called Trinity. My name is Chuck Costa. I am the Vice President of the Foundation, the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation, and I'm a longtime worker at the Nevada Test Site. I was with the U.S. Public Health Service for 30 years, coming to the test site in 1962, retiring from the Public Health Service in 1992. This after ending up directing what was called the Off-Site Radiation Safety Program for the Department of Energy and becoming a advisory panel member on the Test Controllers Advisory Panel for a nuclear test. And then I went to work for Los Alamos in 1992, spending a little over 15 years with Los Alamos, ending up as a test director for subcritical experiments. So let's talk a little bit about Trinity. Just picture yourself in a remote part of the desert in New Mexico, and it's 4 a.m. in the morning and the rain stopped. It had been raining for quite a while. And then at 10 after 5, the word came out to proceed with the Trinity project. And 19 minutes and 45 seconds later, this part of the desert in New Mexico became the brightest that anybody has ever seen. Remember, it's sort of early in the morning, maybe still a little bit dark. But at that time, almost 5:30 in the morning, the desert just became one big bright area of light. And what had happened was, this was man's first attempt at conducting a nuclear explosion or producing a nuclear explosion, and it was a success. And that was on July 16th, 1945. So on July 16th, 1945, man's first attempt at producing a nuclear explosion was a success. And shortly thereafter, that device, which is behind me, a mock-up of it, was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, and the war ended soon thereafter. So the explosion that took place on July 16th, 1945, down at a remote section of the Alamogordo bombing gunnery range in an area called the Journey of Death, the Jornada del Muerte, or Muerte, the Journey of Death, was a test of the plutonium implosion device that was sitting on a 100-foot tower. And on top of that tower was this gadget, and that's what Los Alamos called this mock-up, or in this particular case, it's a mock-up of the plutonium implosion device. A robust spherical case that housed a plutonium sphere in its center, the plutonium sphere hollow, and the hollow part of the plutonium contained a polonium-beryllium neutron initiator that would, when the plutonium reaches its densest portion, the polonium-beryllium device would interact and produce lots of neutrons. Around that was a very dense tamper material of uranium-238. The tamper material designed to keep the neutrons from escaping, number one, and number two, for squeezing on the plutonium. And surrounding the plutonium, or the tamper material, was several thousand pounds of high explosive, specially designed high explosive with multiple detonators, 32 in fact, that would initiate the high explosive, and a compressive wave formed inward to compress on the tamper material and the plutonium, thus increasing its density from subcritical to supercritical, at which time the neutron generator is crushed, and releasing lots of neutrons, and thus enhancing the chain reaction, and then the explosion takes place. Okay, so why did that nuclear explosion take place? Well, we were concerned that the Germans could come up with a nuclear device or a nuclear weapon. And what was happening in Germany in late 1938 was that Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, a couple of brilliant radiochemists on the German side, were bombarding natural uranium with neutrons, and they see this interesting phenomenon taking place. And what it ended up being that they were actually splitting the uranium atom, releasing lots of energy and additional neutrons. And that research then was told to this country, or the scientists in this country, in early 1939 when Niels Bohr came to give a talk here in the USA. And he talked about the research that was going on in Berlin. And of course, at that time, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany a few years earlier, and he was persecuting the Jews and invading countries. And so Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist, became very concerned that the Germans can come up with and others, that the Germans can come up with an atomic bomb. And so he got with his old instructor, Albert Einstein, who was here in this country by that time, and penned a letter to President Roosevelt. Here's a copy of the letter, with the concern that the Germans could come up with a super weapon. And that was in 1939. We weren't even at war with Japan or Germany at that time, but Roosevelt then felt that very slowly putting money into developing committees and some research that ended up being and we'll talk about that in just a minute, the Manhattan Project and the development of a couple of nuclear weapons, one being the plutonium implosion device, and then the other being the gun assembly device using uranium. One of the breakthroughs back in those early days that allowed scientists to bombard different elements, I guess they started with protons initially, which is positively charged, was this discovery of the neutron by James Chadwick in 1932. The neutron, which is a critical part of the nucleus, being neutral, could penetrate nucleuses much deeper than a proton, which was positively charged. And so scientists, starting in those early days, began bombarding different elements with neutrons. Some of the early ones were, well, we already talked about Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann bombarding natural uranium with neutrons. They were helped with Lisa Meitner, who worked with them for a while until Hitler started persecuting the Jews. She was Jewish, and so she fled to Sweden, but stayed in touch with Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. And basically later on, with her nephew, told them, hey, you guys are splitting the atom, and more neutrons are being emitted, which is a key, as we'll discuss. A lot of the people that came to Los Alamos because of Oppenheimer, we'll get to that in just a minute, are shown in this display here. Some of the key people that were involved with producing different materials, the plutonium and the uranium, and the theoretical work that went into designing the plutonium implosion device and the gun assembly device. You can see Hans Bethe, you can see Enrico Fermi, and a number of others. And that is part of this display, is that we'll see different people that were responsible for this program at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project days. So the Manhattan Project was responsible, that's what it was called. Basically, the military was the lead organization for the Manhattan Project, and the leader was General Leslie Groves, who had just come off of the Pentagon for constructing the Pentagon. But the scientific leaders were people like, well, the scientific leader was Robert Oppenheimer. Dr. Oppenheimer, a brilliant theoretical physicist, came out of the University of California, Berkeley, and he was the prime organizer for bringing in the brain power to Los Alamos. He was familiar with the research that was going on in the country at the universities and and private organizations. He knew who the people were, and he convinced the people to come to Los Alamos to do the research and the design and the testing, development of the atomic bomb. Another key person that came to Los Alamos was Enrico Fermi. As a matter of fact, in 1934, Enrico Fermi was bombarding uranium with neutrons, and he saw this splitting of the atom, but he wasn't convinced as to that he knew what the byproducts were, and basically he thought they were byproducts of uranium, or I should say other isotopes of uranium. So he did that in 1934, I believe it was. And then, of course, in 1938, you had Strassman and Otto Hahn bombarding natural uranium in Germany. So Fermi was sort of ahead of the game, but he also, in 1942, at the University of Chicago, built a graphite uranium pile where he demonstrated the first control chain reaction. And that research was used to build the reactors at Hanford, Washington, where they produced the plutonium for the research and the weapons. One of the reasons why the military was brought into the Manhattan Project was because they were experienced at purchasing land, for example, for big construction, building large facilities, and so on. And one of the challenges in those days, a big challenge in those days, was the building or the procurement of materials to be used for the research and to be used for the weapons. And the two materials that were key to this whole thing was uranium-235 and plutonium-239. So in addition to the facilities at Los Alamos that housed the scientists, they also built facilities up in Hanford, Washington for tens of thousands of workers. And Hanford, Washington was the site for the building of the reactors to produce the plutonium, and then the chemical separation plants for separating the plutonium from the uranium. And then, of course, they also had to build cities to accommodate the workers, and tens of thousands of workers. And not only in Hanford, Washington, but back at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as you see in the background. Oak Ridge, Tennessee was the location for the production of uranium, the separation of uranium-235 from natural uranium. They had built these humongous facilities that were for gaseous separation and also for electromagnetic separation. Uranium-235 being a little bit lighter than the uranium-238, and using that for separating the two and getting that material to Los Alamos and ultimately to be used for Little Boy, which was the uranium device. Los Alamos, which was called Project Y, was a much smaller construction effort, even though for the early scientists, the facilities at Los Alamos were pretty primitive, but they got better with time. And of course, the Los Alamos is where the research was done to ultimately build and test the atomic bomb, the plutonium implosion device. I just want to point out Lisa Gordon Haggerty, who is the administrator for the National Nuclear Security Administration, was here about a week ago. And in her quote that you see there, she said that Trinity was arguably the greatest scientific experiment ever conducted. She liked the exhibit. She liked the case, that the ballistics case that we have just on the outside, and we'll take a look at that on our way out. A couple of things. Los Alamos, when they were working on producing the nuclear devices, started out with the gun assembly concept, that they thought early on that both uranium and plutonium would work in a gun assembly configuration. And in that configuration, basically what you have are a subcritical piece of uranium-235, they thought plutonium at the time, on one end. At the end of that target material was a polonium, beryllium neutron initiator. On the upper end, behind some explosive material, was another subcritical piece of uranium-235 to be fired down a gun barrel to interact with the target material to convert, to go from subcritical to supercritical, which means that the nucleus, the atoms are very close together, and when the neutrons are initiated here, it goes bang. One of the problems was bringing those two pieces together at the right time, in a very short time. Uranium, you could do that, but plutonium would not work, because in the plutonium that was coming out of Hanford, Washington, it had some plutonium-240, which were spontaneously releasing neutrons, and you couldn't get the two pieces of plutonium to mate fast enough without having a pre-detonation. And so they gave up on using plutonium in this gun assembly configuration and went to the implosion concept, which they really put their forces together on at Los Alamos in 1944, and of course they demonstrated that it was in the test of the Trinity test on July 16, 1945, that concept would work. Here you see a Fat Man case that the plutonium implosion device that you see here would be situated in. Ultimately, this was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan on August 9th, and the Japanese surrendered soon thereafter. Another display of some of the scientists that came to Los Alamos to help with this tremendous effort. Obviously, it worked very well. I mentioned that materials like uranium and plutonium are very difficult to come by, and as they started thinking about conducting a test, the plutonium implosion test, they get to thinking, well, what happens if this is not going to work? We're going to expend material that is very difficult to come by. And so some of the scientists said maybe we ought to fire the implosion device in a cylinder, in what was called jumbo. Lots of controversy there. Jumbo was not insignificant to hold a device like you see there with several thousand pounds of high explosive just to preserve the plutonium. It ended up that they did build a jumbo, and the jumbo, as you can see here in this historic photo, is about 25 feet long, 12 feet in diameter, 14-inch thick steel walls. I mean, it was a real jumbo. It turned out as they proceeded with time, they had more confidence, and as they proceeded in time, there was more and more material becoming available, so they didn't think they would need it. This jumbo still exists down there. I believe it was situated some 800 feet away from the actual detonation of Trinity, and it survived. The tower that supported it didn't survive, but jumbo survived. Another one of the things that they did down there, which I thought was very interesting, and by the way, you can see these historic photographs that have to do with the Trinity saga, was that on May 7th, 1945, they actually detonated 100 tons of TNT that was stacked up on top of a 20-foot high wooden structure, just to detonate it, to see that, to help with the calibration of instruments, to see what kind of shock would be produced and what kind of distances. They actually, in the reactors at Hanford, placed some uranium-235 or uranium in these tubes, irradiated it, and created a lot of follow material, which they were able to track later on. So apparently this was a very successful test, and this occurred just before the actual Trinity explosion, just a month or so before, a couple months. There are other photos as you go around, which are kind of neat. It shows the tower that was used, a 100-foot tower, and some of the people that were associated with the project. Okay, this is kind of interesting, I thought, because we used the same information later on with our testing out in the Pacific and at the Nevada test site, and that is a good understanding of the weather at test time. And in this particular case, you can see that the ground zero of the Trinity site was about south and east of Socorro, New Mexico, out on the Alamogordo bombing range. They desired a trajectory that would go to the northeast, keeping it away at least from close-in ranchers and people and communities as much as possible. So weather played a major role in the conduct of Trinity, again, to keep the radiation exposures to a minimum by the time that material got out to populated areas. We talked about the gadget associated with the exhibit, which is the main attraction, the gadget being the plutonium implosion device. But it's obviously not a weaponized version. You wouldn't drop that from a B-29, for example. The gadget was housed for the one that was dropped on Nagasaki. As you can see here, was housed in a ballistics case. And from the gadget, it was now called Fat Man. This is an actual Fat Man ballistics case that would have been was dropped from the B-29, not this particular one. So picture the gadget inside this. This is 3/8 inch thick steel alloy, or steel armor, as a matter of fact. The whole thing weighs about 3,500 pounds. There are 4 parts to this case. You got the tail assembly attached to the rear part of it, and the front part, the front half, and then you've got the nose cap up here. So 4 pieces made this assembly, and just picture the gadget inside there. The gadget being attached to the perimeter of this, where the front half and the second half come together, and the gadget being on the inside. Again, that was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, from a B-29 out of a that was called Boxcar, B-O-C-K-S car. That was the B-29. And what happens was, once it's released, a timer is activated to allow for this thing to be dropped for 15 seconds before anything else becomes activated, just to get it away from the B-29 so it's not affected in any way. Then the barometric pressure switches take over, and as it drops down through the different altitudes, when it gets down to around 7,000 feet. The B-29, by the way, is at around 31,000 feet. Once it gets down to around 7,000 feet, the barometric switches tell the fire set up front, and that's, if we went back to the gadget, that was that nose part of it. It would tell the battery to go ahead and charge up the capacitors. That's up in this general area. And then the radar take over, and we have 4 radar antennas, and they were set at around 1,800 feet to be detonated at 1,800 feet off of the surface. And once 2 of those radar antennas we're now at 1,800 feet, then it tells the capacitors to release the energy to the 32 detonators at the same time, and then it goes bang. And that's it.